there's a shifting metaphor in the way that we are looking at the word called resource, at least for environmental historians. For many years, it was a stock, and if you see this picture, this hill that's been cut up, right, and there's not enough trees on one side, this would hold in the 60s and 70s and 80s. If you were to actually make a presentation in those days and you wanted to point out the horrors of environmental degradation, you would have a picture of degrading forests or depleting natural resources. But increasingly, you have a metaphor that is there on my left, the carbon footprint, all right? Increasingly, this picture can be used for discussions on resources and on pollution and on degradation. But what does it mean to shift, to have carbon as something that you can insert in the politics of resources? I mean, that's the kind of question that I'm trying to pursue and ask. The point that I'm trying to understand here is that how do you understand the transformation of carbon into the idea of resource? Not simply as stock, but really when the resource is literally gas, atmosphere, right? And it also requires us to have a very global sense of the problem. You have the local, but it's something that relates to the global in very profound and fundamental ways that is new to the way that we write environmental history, roughly putting. So it's not only, we could have used the word local struggles or local communities or natural communities or organic communities. Today, it's very hard to write environmental histories without a sense of the global. That's one of the, I would say, qualifiers when you discuss carbon as resource. The second thing is about anxiety. And I think that is something that really needs a lot of very careful reflection today, because anxiety can be expressed as a problem of logistics. Too many people, too few resources, drought, floods, something that goes beyond politics. It is often expressed in that fashion, something that is beyond politics. Some of us would like to argue that when we write environmental histories, it's not the environmental histories of logistics, but actually recovering relationships of power. And that is another dimension of this problem. How do we recover histories about climate change as relationships of power? It's not a given in the way it's often written. And because of that, in a strange way, the idea of history has become, not that it never was a project of politics, but it's become an intensely political project today. I mean, there is no way one can ignore the problem of politics in writing environmental histories anymore. Yeah? So I would argue that the term historical responsibility actually is a very technical term. It is linked to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, yeah? In which they argued that there is a relationship between past responsibilities and, past emissions and future responsibilities. So if you had a high past emission, a country, then its responsibilities for taking up the burden of mitigation, etc., would be higher. That was basically the principle of historical responsibility. But here's the catch, and why increasingly it's becoming more of a moral problem. History as a moral problem rather than fact. Because the idea of historical responsibility now is broken up into two halves. There's one dimension which is proportional. That is, it's about modeling historical contributions, right? So if you were to get a country X and you could establish that this was its historical responsibility, this is the amount of emissions over the course of time it has generated and produced, then this will be what we expect from them. Yeah? Roughly, that's the formula. However, the science today has been inadequate in actually establishing proportion of guilt. Because this is the gradient of cause and effect. Emissions, concentrations, radiative forcing, temperature, impact, cost, all of them, to cut it short, are non-linear equations. You can't quite track down exactly the emissions that belongs to one country in particular, right? Borders have also changed to aggravate matters. So what was something that was a clear principle has actually been confused at the level of science. So if you cannot correctly establish on such an important issue as carbon emissions, then what are you left with? You're left with the idea of convergence. That is to say that how do we decide moral obligations, not based on fact that science can establish, but on what the best we can do is say capacities to act, which is again a very social science question, that which countries have the capacity to act on the question of climate change, yeah? And what kinds of responsibilities and what kinds of expectations can be given to them. So now we have a context in which history is going to be written as a moral problem, not necessarily as a problem of science and fact. Yeah? So what do we do in that situation? To complicate things, I'm sure you're aware of the word Anthropocene. It's acquired an unusual bounce and buzz in recent times. What it simply means is that it's a human-determined word. So it's culture plus culture. Even nature, quite famously actually brought into focus by this book in 1989 called The End of Nature. I forgot the name, sorry. The End of Nature, it'll come back to me in a short while, in which the argument was that you've transformed climates in such profound and fundamental ways that nature as a independent, autonomous, spontaneous substance, independent of the human condition, no longer exists. Everything has been transformed by human action. And that is what the word Anthropocene is supposed to capture, that there is no more nature out there. We are left only with ourselves, right? So when we talk about nature today, we are actually talking about a different version of culture, roughly put. Now, you get these very interesting ways in which it's being talked about, and this is in a light-hearted way. Hydrogen is a light, odorless gas which, given enough time, changes into people. That kind of, ease with which people and nature now is being talked about. So the politics of the Anthropocene is very interesting because if there is no other, mind you, a lot of liberation ecology or liberation political ecology and political ecology was premised on the belief that there was something external to industrial capitalism and to capitalism, and it was a force of nature that was, for whatever it could do, was upsetting modernization and equality and justice and so on and so forth. Now that we have collapsed nature into culture, how do we think about it and how do we understand its politics? Now this is where the scientists come in, and I've sort of been studying this quite carefully. The I Hope project, the integrated history and future of people on Earth, started by a theoretical physicist, the Darlin Conference 2005. Earlier to that, they had a workshop in 2003. And what they did was they laid out this plan for future history writing. And the plan is something like this. We're going to look at deep time, huge slices of time, 100,000, 200,000 years, yeah? Or 10,000 years. The idea is that Anthropocene marks a profound shift from human experiences with nature, and that it is a dangerous moment in human history because it's 450 parts per million carbon, and you're going to reach a point where you're no longer going to experience what is called the Holocene variable and normal, right? So for about 12,000 years, a certain kind of variability which made human possibility possible is no longer going to be there. We are going to enter an era of uncertainty, right? So the Darwin Conference actually ended up arguing that we've got to now turn history into a way of calculating, measuring, and controlling risk. So you now have history that no longer is just about documenting power and people and long histories and patterns of change, but actually getting history to talk to policy. That is really the effort here. And the science of history to talk to policy. So we have a very unusual and new version of history. But what is troubling And this is something that is troubling for many people in the global south. And when I say that, I'm aware that, countries and governments are often very different from people, yeah, right? So when you say global south, it's not to take into the Indian elite as part of, as part of the suffering poor. They're not. And there are contradictions, and I'll explain that a bit later. But the Great Acceleration as an idea is very interesting. What it poses as a problem, as a central problem, is that at what point shall we say that carbon actually begins to transform us into the Anthropocene? So there's various debates. Some have argued that ever since we got into settled agriculture, we've entered the era of the epoch of the Anthropocene. But the more careful arguments are one that says it's 1784 with the steam engine, and then there's a documentation of what carbon output is. But they've actually ended up concluding, the Great Acceleration and people who've advocated it, is that the fundamental shift starts in 1945. So when really carbon becomes a problem for people in the South, that's very interesting, because now suddenly historical responsibility disappears. During the period of decolonization and nation building of the South, that's when carbon becomes a problem, right? So now you have a history that's reworked that obscures the whole question of responsibility. So you end up with something that sounds good, but fairly dangerous for those who are arguing for South politics. And that is common vulnerabilities and shared responsibilities. That is really the echo of the slogan today. That is, we are all in this together, right? Now, this is exactly what the South, or those who've always argued about the term historical responsibility, have argued that that's not exactly how it looks. We're not all in this together. That the rich do have lifeboats, that there is a long history to how this situation has arrived at. And so, despite the drumbeat that we're all in this together, that if the idea of historical responsibility disappears, then the whole logic of making these arguments for differential responsibility is going to start weakening and disappearing. So, what I'm trying to suggest here and make the case is something like this. How does South Asian environmental history now, given that you have histories that are emerging that try to show you as common vulnerabilities and shared responsibilities, how do you pose the problem then of historical responsibility and difference? How does that play out? That's becoming a major question. So I've sort of mapped out South Asian environmental history, not a very deep field in the sense that it's really the 1980s, late 1980s, in which the field emerged. So there's these characteristics. In the 1980s, environmental history essentially argued the following. They had something called the colonial watershed thesis, which they said, okay, much of South Asia was in some sort of ecological harmony, but with the emergence of colonial rule, or the introduction of colonial rule, somewhere in the 19th century, there's a massive disruption. So when in doubt, blame the British. That was the kind of way in which that history was being written. But they had other problems with it. They assumed that there was a natural community that was ecologically harmonious. And they also assumed that the way to the future is through the past. That is, if South Asia could just recover its past, it would have a future. That was the way it was argued. But by the 1990s, suddenly there was a shift. And I argue in a different paper that the 1980s was about writing against state developmentalism. But as soon as you get the idea of economic growth, that history became far more pragmatic. But also, it started with a very different sense of what nature is. And that, which Ian Scoones actually documents very well in an article, a realization that nature is not in equilibrium, but fairly stochastic. It has no purpose, it has no design. That you get these changes and shifts without there being a trans-historical essential notion of nature. So if I would say that we need to preserve forests, then it also would follow the question is a forest in which century? I mean, are you talking about forests of the temperate region, which actually 400,000 years ago was probably part of a desert? You know, the planet has been moving. We don't have an essence, we don't have a point of origin. Nature has always been transforming. So what you get is environmental history that's extremely pragmatic, problem solving, but without a natural community to fall back on. So in a way, the present was being rewritten or re-understood to get to the future, right? And the present creates the future. Now with Anthropocene, we have a very, very interesting situation. And I don't know if one is familiar with this, but the idea of the novel climate, that is, we are now reached a point where, since the future might not really be connected to the past, that is, what we are going to witness is going to be unprecedented. So novel climates and no analog communities, that is, communities that historically we've drawn associations with in the natural world, those existence might not be probable. Yeah? So we are looking at a future that is so uncertain that the past is not really a way to understand it. And so in the Anthropocene politics, the present is the only thing that we have. Yeah? So you get these three big changes. The past is the way to the future, the present is the way to create the future, and now we have only the present. Yeah. So this brings, again, very profoundly so, that what are the ways in which you can now write South Asian environmental histories, given that you still want to retain a sense of historical responsibility, right? What is the way you can write these histories that deal with the idea of shared responsibilities and common vulnerabilities, right? How do we actually map the disconnect between a vision in which this is only one planet, we're all in this together, climate affects all of us, there's no lifeboats for the rich, and you create a narrative where you argue that actually the north-south divide does exist, and that the responsibilities for certain acts of emission should be disproportionately borne by people who have had a longer, if you must, crime associated with the production of carbon. Yeah? So today, writing South Asian environmental history has become a real problem, that we no longer have a narrative to strike a difference. Also given the fact that scientists are beginning to rewrite global environmental histories with huge blocks of time, and they're making certain things about historical crimes disappear. Yeah? So this is the dilemma I wanted to present, and I'm hoping that in the course of the 3 days of this conference that we will have many more occasions to actually flag and discuss this as a problem of resource politics, of historical imagination, and most crucially about what I would still consider a viable and important and credible political exercise, the problem of historical responsibility. Yeah? Thank you.